him in his place.
All right.
I
Uh,
just tweeted
we-
out. I just tweeted out the live stream. Um, but the thing about you were just saying before the people that say, oh, this universe only exists in our mind. The thing is that they're getting physics mixed up with metaphysics, like very
Oh
bad.
oh
God.
yeah, that's
Oh
that's the thing
God.
with materialists. They always do. But
They
hey,
always get things mixed up.
we are live. So hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am joined today here very graciously with two fellow Catholics who have agreed to talk about the faith and proper governance, which is it's something I haven't done on my channel personally before. I haven't gotten into my faith too much, so I'm happy to do so here. And I'm joined by Ghost of Buckley and Fascist Ball the Fourth, or
Hey,
just V4.
yeah.
Hello there.
Uh, although many Catholics or will not consider me part of the church, but
Yes,
we
yes.
gotta we gotta bear with that.
The whole sedevacantism is a bit.
Yeah.
It's a bit. Some people find it a bit iffy, but it is what it is.
Oh
I think I found
well.
And
funny
so,
about it is that most of the people that have bashed me for being a sedevacantist have been Orthodox, which I suspect since they don't know much about sedevacantism, they believe that like sedevacantists reject the papacy, which we don't. But they believe that we reject the papacy, and they say, "Oh man, he's close to converting to Orthodoxism." And it's like, no, that's not how it works.
I actually once read about this one author who wrote a book called "Why Sedevacantism Proves." Uh, Why Sedevacantism Proves Orthodoxy, where he basically said, well, sedevacantism actually disproves the papacy, because if the papacy was true, then there wouldn't be sedevacantists.
that's dumb.
I mean, that's debatable because we did have a time on the Middle Ages where we had several popes, and most of the people didn't know like which pope was the right pope and which pope was not. Um, we had a pope in Rome, a pope in Avignon, and then a completely different pope that was in a position of both of them in Pisa.
Mm.
And I believe that the allegiances varied between the kingdoms. Uh, I think that the kingdoms in the east, like Hungary, Poland, Sweden, I think England were loyal to Rome, and then France and Spain were loyal to Avignon, and then different parts of the Holy Roman Empire were loyal to Pisa.
Yeah, it was. The Western Schism was that was a
Yeah,
ride, but
the Western
it's
Schism.
it's interesting that we talk about loyalties to various popes because it's one of the things that I think has come up with an issue with me lately because way back in the day I used to be ANCAP and I used to believe that that could have been consistent with church doctrine on the state, but since
Hmm.
then I have learned better. But
Oh well, yeah, that's good to hear. You might want to take those findings to Tom Woods.
yeah,
Well,
Yeah.
all seriousness, all seriousness. I am of the opinion that while one could be a principled Catholic and a prudential ANCAP, the principles of anarcho-capitalism, as laid out by someone like Mary Rothbard, are just flat out incompatible. I
mm,
mean, their definition of self-ownership is just it's not even incompatible with Christianity, much less
yeah.
Catholicism.
It's very much that ghetto ethics that Rothbard kind of endorsed that allows you to like make statements like what if the child consents though, and so it's really something that I'm happy I moved away from. But that does get to the question of what is like properly prescribed governance for the church, because a lot of times when you think about stuff like Catholicism has existed for essentially 2 millennia at this point, and it's coexisted with multiple forms of national governance. And as far as I know, it's only come out against a few things, and one of those things is against anarchism. Obviously, there's a section within the Catechism I can't quite remember that says the church does advocate for some form of a state because it sees it necessary for like the moral spine of like a society. And then the only other doctrine against an ideology or a form of governance that I could think of is Pope Pius XII's edict against communism, or the decree against communism in 1949. And so as far as I know, those are really the only two specific forms of governance that the church has come out against. So I'd be very interested to hear what you guys think the church would prescribe, or would at least prefer in terms of a form of governance.
Well, I would. that's that's the thing. That's the beauty of the Catholic faith. We have a whole range of principles that we have to abide by, but within that space, within those rules, there is plenty to debate. Catholic, you could be a Catholic who advocates for something like the American something like a 1930s New Dealer style leftism, or you could be someone like William F. Buckley, who was a fusionist who believed in social conservatism with free markets. You could also within Catholicism, you could also decide, you know what, we need someone like a Francisco Franco, and that would also be a legitimate form of governance under Catholicism. It really depends a lot, I think, on the individual circumstances. I think that there was this one reactionary. He wrote a book called "Liberalism is a Sin." Funny title, huh? And he talked about how the form of government does not truly matter, or it is whether the principles behind it are Catholic. Because he gave examples of Catholic republics and anti-Catholic monarchies, and he said these are the form of government does not matter so long as it adheres to Catholic principles. That's my view of Catholic governance. Now, what those Catholic principles are, I can go into a bit more detail, but I'd like to hear what Fascist Ball has to say.
Yeah, as would I. Fascist Ball?
Where did he go?
Is he still here? Oh. I think he might have just stepped out for a moment.
Well, I could go over like a couple of the basic principles of a Catholic
well, I don't
Catholic governance. I mean, the two main ones I can think of off the top of my head are solidarity, which is the principle solidarity, which is the principle that there is no atomic individual in the society. Everybody is connected. Everybody is part of a community and connected to each other. So there is no sovereign individual like you would see in objectivism, but also the principle of subsidiarity, which is where you want power to be devolved to the lowest local form of government. The lowest power should be devolved to the lowest level, because local governments can help the people better and help deal with local problems better.
It's interesting,
and it's also I think Pope Leo XIII wrote that it was a grave injustice for a higher government to step into a local problem where it didn't need to be.
Interesting. Well, I'm certainly in favor of some form of localized governance for the exact reasons you laid out, being that local governments are always better suited to deal with the problems of a much greater, a much more concentrated group of people, and can therefore deal with the problem more directly. But on top of that, I thought it interesting that you brought up monarchy and that one reactionary, because there was a quote I'd found some time ago, but I didn't save it. And it went something along the lines of, it's odd to advocate to be a member of a republic on Earth when you concede that the universe itself is a monarchy. And I thought that was a very interesting quote because it's it's essentially true. We do believe that God, of course, is Jesus Christ is King of the universe and such, and so it would make sense, therefore, if we were to try to replicate as above, so below, we would try to achieve some form of monarchic rule on Earth as well.
Well, there has been arguments like that, but I would like to point out that there is a part of Samuel in the Bible that talks about the negative consequences of having a king, and just to let you know, you don't really need to be a kingdom to recognize Jesus Christ as your king. In fact, I would say, I mean, the Republic of Poland is the perfect example of this. But besides that, I would say having that sort of absolute monarch is I would hesitate to say that's been good for the church. I mean, if you look at like the integralists in France, they had problems because the king kept on interfering with the affairs of the church. He kept interfering with who became bishops and stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean,
is always
that's a problem even in communist China today. So I mean, any form of complete absolute power is going to allow that sort of thing to happen.
Yep.
However, I think
that has a name is Caesaropapism or Caesaropapism, which is the position where the leader, the Caesar has authority over the Pope. Caesar over Pope.
Yeah, and that's certainly a problem. Obviously, we saw that going back to the Council of Nicaea. No, was it Nicaea or Constantinople where Constantine tried to?
Yeah, Nicaea.
Yeah, so it's obviously a problem when you have absolute authority like that. However, it was going back to when monarchies were very early forming. Like even if you were to travel back in time to the days of Charlemagne, you oftentimes had religion as such an integral part of culture and such an integral part of life that really there was a respect from government authorities for leaving the faith as it is and trying not to interfere. That's kind of been lost today. So I feel it was sorry.
Yeah, Caesaropapism is a part that it has been throughout the history of Christianity, has been a very integral part of it. Even in the Western Church, in the Catholic Church during the times of the Roman Empire, Caesaropapism was the de facto. The Pope, the Caesar had authority over the Church. It was not until later in the Middle Ages where we could really speak about, the Pope actually having independence from, the Emperor, or later on the Holy Roman Emperor, because the Pope had his own state. He had the Papal State. That was the whole purpose of the Papal State. It was to ensure that the Pope would not be tied to any foreign power, which worked out with relative success.
I would say that there was this one, if I remember correctly, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Boniface and Pope. There's this one Pope. I forgot his name. I think it was Pope Boniface the something. Boniface the Eighth, I believe. No, wait, no, he.
Well, what was the general story? We'll try to figure it out as you tell the story.
Okay, what happened was he had a feud with a king named Philip the Fourth. Boniface the Eighth did, I believe, and he he released a papal bull called Ausculta Fili, which means "Listen, my son." And Boniface VIII appealed to Philip IV to listen to the Vicar of Christ as the spiritual monarch of all earthly kings, and and he protested against the trial of churchmen before royal courts, and and the continued use of church funds for state purposes. And and announced he would summon the bishops and abbots of France to take measures for the preservation of the liberties of the church. When the bull was presented to Philip IV, some of the people reportedly snatched it from Boniface's emissary and flung it into the fire. And then the Pope issued another bull, papal bull called Unum Sanctum, Unum Sanctum, which declared both the spiritual and temporal powers were under the Pope's jurisdiction, and that kings were subordinate to the power of the Roman pontiff. Now, so that is probably, and this was in 1302. So this is probably what you were talking about when you said that in the later Middle Ages, the Caesaro-papism changed. This was like a turning point in church-state relationships. Suddenly, the Pope was in charge of Caesar. The church was in charge of Caesar.
It was not that much that the Pope is in charge of Caesar, but that Caesar is not in charge of the Pope. It's not about the Pope being superior to a ruler, but that the rulers don't have influence over the church, over the Pope specifically. And this is not convenient for the European powers. This is why there is many attempts to bringing back Caesaropapism, and the most important church that currently today has a fully, because I could talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church and how they have something similar to that, but the one that has like full Caesaropapism right now is the Church of England, on which the head of the church is the Queen of England. This is a perfect example of Caesaropapism.
Yeah, for all the good it's doing them.
Yeah.
Well, they're Protestant, so
yeah.
Yeah, but they're a special kind of Protestant because their Protestantism doesn't come out of feelings of distrust towards the Catholic Church or perceiving the Catholic Church as corrupt. None of that. Like most of the European powers converted to Protestantism because of that, not because the theological system was superior to Catholicism, but because it was the perfect excuse to break away from the Catholic Church and have their own thing because of their own, problems they had with the Catholic Church, which come from before that. There was already a desire for the reform in Europe. But in England, this was not present. The sole reason why the Church of England broke away was because of Henry VIII and his divorce.
In some sense, I find that a little bit more in... careful, Buckley, you're scratching your mic there.
Oh, okay.
In some respects, I find that the Church of England breaking away from the Catholic Church a little bit more infuriating than, say, just the parts of northern Germany and Scandinavia joining Protestantism, because there was seriously no philosophical or theological grounds for the Church of England to break away. Like, I can understand almost having a sort of sense that the Church's theology and philosophy has been corrupted and the need to try to purify it almost. I can sort of understand that, but but the Church of England doesn't have that excuse. They were greedy essentially. Like their king wanted more wives, and the state wanted to claim church land so they could start to use the benefits of the funds that the church had collected, which almost makes it even more annoying. But
I mean,
sorry,
I'm not going to deny that there was not a need to reform the church, because there definitely was a need to reform the church. The church was in a huge need for reform, sorry. But this reform already happened. It was called the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent fixed all the problems that the church had prior to that one council. All the concerns that the European people had over the church were fixed in the Council of Trent. So after the Council of Trent, there is absolutely no reason to remain a Protestant other than political reasons, other than the benefits that you might get, the political benefits that you might get from having a state church, or from breaking away from the Catholic Church, or just simply because you want another woman.
Yeah, and so I find that's another one of the problems with the church's history that it's had, and that being that a lot of times states will use the church and religion, more broadly speaking, as a guise for some sort of really politically motivated action. I think the perfect example of this would be the Spanish Inquisition, which may have started out, at least at first, in a minor sense, to try to stop heresy that was spreading in the area, but eventually became a state-led inquisition against political opponents. But of course, whenever you ask somebody who's not well versed in church history or medieval history, they'll just blame the church itself and act like it's all the Catholic Church's fault for doing what it did, even though over the course of 300 years, something like only 3,000 people or so died, which isn't a good thing, of course, but it's certainly not a unique atrocity in scale.
On that level, more people die per year in Texas than due to the death penalty.
Not even that. If we talk about the Spanish Inquisition and how many people they killed, the Spanish Inquisition in its whole existence, its whole more than 300 years of existence, killed less people than the French Revolution killed in 1 month.
Or less than, or approximately the same amount as 9/11 did in just that single day.
Yeah,
it's really it's an irrelevant scale almost, and the fact that people bring it up is disappointing. But is there, in your opinions, a way in which you could separate religious motivation and political motivation so that this sort of confusion wouldn't happen again? Is there some sort of system in which the two wouldn't get intertwined as they had been in the past?
Well, the best is... Okay, I'll let Fascist go back.
Scratching your mic a little bit, like you can hear, like it sounds like very heavy sounds coming out of it.
What about this?
Every once in a while.
Is this good?
Yeah,
it's
that's better. What I was saying is that the Spanish Inquisition was not established to combat heresies. It was established to persecute Jews. That is why it was established, because there was after we took Granada, there was a lot of Muslims and Jews that lived over there. The last Sephardic Jews still lived over there, and they we wanted them to convert to Catholicism, but when we forced them and we force baptized them, they didn't actually convert. They just pretended like they did, and they continued to have to practice their religion in secret, or to have a syncretic religion between Catholicism and Judaism. And what they were doing is they were Judaizing the area around the city of Granada. And so this is why the Inquisition is created, right, as a form of persecuting these crypto Jews and these crypto Muslims. And this doesn't work. The Inquisition failed.
It wasn't.
Task.
I don't think that was exactly okay. I don't think that the Inquisition was supposed to be used against lay people. Remember, I always thought that the Inquisition was mainly against clergy that were secretly peddling heresy like crypto Judaism.
I mean, yeah, that would be cutting the snake's head, but the Inquisition was a little bit like the DEA back then. It doesn't go for one specific person, because of course that wouldn't solve anything. It tries to go for like the person that is spreading.
One of the things that the Inquisition did, I would also point out, was that it helped prevent a lot of the sort of witch hunts that you saw before, because before then there were just all these essentially lynch mobs going after random people. The Inquisition systematized it and brought some kind of evidentiary standard, so that it wasn't just killing random people who the crowds thought were.
Of course.
It wasn't this like cowboy lynching mobs going around anymore.
Of course, and it would be much preferable for a person back then that was a heretic to be, captured and tried by the Inquisition than to be lynched by the people.
Well, yeah, and I would
Was there?
say that I always thought that the Inquisition was mainly like this like the internal affairs of the Catholic Church. You know, they hunt down the people that do bad within their ranks.
Well, it's also. I think there's also a good amount of evidence to point to the idea that eventually it just came to the point where the Spanish government itself started using the Inquisition to prosecute political prisoners as well. And so,
Oh yeah, I think that the church criticized them for that. Yes.
I mean,
yeah,
okay, when you have such a confessional system as, the Kingdom of Spain was, there was little difference between a political enemy and a religious enemy.
fair enough. I mean, there's some evidence though, I think, to point like, who is it? Who wrote The Pit and the Pendulum? Who was that? Was that Poe? Or I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking of long stories of that line, and I'm thinking along the evidence that was based on, because it just happened to be some of the things I went over in a class a while ago. But it wasn't under her. There was certainly an intertwining of religious and state enemies, no doubt, because it was a confessionary state. But at the same time, there was certainly a distinct attitude amongst the Spanish that they were going to go after enemies, specifically who were speaking out against the various transitioning kings and such. And so obviously that could be seen as some sort of revolt against the order established by the Catholic Church.
But I
But
don't think that the Inquisition's task was to persecute these people.
no, you're right. It wasn't at first. My point is that the state kind of took it, the Spanish state kind of took it and ran with it, which is eventually why the church tried to distance themselves from it, however successful they were in that attempt. And I mean, I'm not exactly opposed to there being a union of church and state, like maybe not a theocratic type thing, but I'm not opposed to the type of monarchies that existed in Europe, like Henry VIII before he split from the church, or the various King Louis of France, or the people like King Charles of the Holy Roman Empire. I'm not opposed to those type of things, but the trouble is then how do you prevent things like runaway abuse of church quote unquote authority in those states?
I mean, the reason why the Inquisition might have been utilized later on to persecute what one may consider political enemies of the crown rather than enemies of the faith is because the Inquisition had a task and it failed on that task. The task of the Inquisition was, like I said, to persecute the crypto Muslims and crypto Jews that were living in Granada, and to make sure that they actually convert to Catholicism. To ensure the correct transition of uh, Jewish and Muslim faith towards Catholicism, and it failed because there was a rebellion against the Inquisition. There was the rebellion of the Alpujarras, or the Morisco rebel. And after this rebel, uh, what the church does, what the Catholic Church does, is that it expels every single Jew and Muslim from Granada, and it resettles the area with northern Catholic settlers. And so the Inquisition, after all these Jews and all these Muslims are gone from Spain, and there is absolutely no task for the Inquisition, it was not dissolved. It was utilized for other tasks, be it persecuting heretics, being censoring, stuff that may be against the church, uh, persecuting, bunch of tasks that were not in relation with primary task of the Inquisition. And so I'm sure that perhaps one of these tasks might have been persecuting political enemies, although I am not sure of to what extent this was. I'm not sure how many political uh, enemies of the state were persecuted using the Inquisition. I'm not sure if this was like isolated cases or if this was like a generalized thing. I'm not sure about that.
Hmm. Well, I think that segues kind of nicely into another problem you have with what type of governance works best with church, because you have a couple, conflicting ideals or ideas you have to try to find a balance between. One of those being self ownership, because you to call back to the decree that Pope Pius XII made in 1949, in that decree against communism, which he made, he went into great lengths that humans should be afforded a certain amount of property rights and should be allowed self-ownership and things along that line. But of course, there's also a very communal element to what the church preaches about how you need to care for your fellow man, how we're all made in God's image, and things along that line. So it becomes a balance between how much freedom do we give someone and self-autonomy versus how much do we sort of impose the moral law of the church and how much in freedom do we infringe upon. And so I think in deciding a type of governance to use, there's flexibility within any type of governance, obviously, but some are obviously more prone to a more moral authoritarian outtake, while some are obviously more prone to hyper individualism, to say along those lines.
Well, I like Pope John Paul II's definition of freedom. Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. True freedom, if you, in the Catholic context, is not just the freedom to just do whatever you want with no limit, with as no limits or as few limits as possible. It's the ability to do the right thing. It's the freedom to practice God's faith as the best you can. This is something that I think this is something that is consistent with the long tradition of Catholic teaching on the subject of freedom, and that another important point to talk about when you talk about restricting people's freedoms is if it's prudential to do so in a specific circumstance. Like you could say, as someone like Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine would, that while it would be best if there was no brothels, it might not be prudent to just ban all the brothels in a city, and so you'd want a few of them in a certain area, and because this is the city of man.
Well,
by the way, I'm not advocating for libertarianism. I think
yeah, I mean, I know.
Just to let you know,
You're just advocating for something more.
I'm just saying. I'm for banning pornography, so I'm just saying there could be instances where in practice it would be more prudent for Christians to argue for that, argue against banning something just because it's sinful.
I mean, there's many things that we could use. The thing is that not to use religion as a simple excuse for banning this or banning that. If you actually ban something, it has to be for a reason. It has to be because it is actually being harmful to this, or it's being harmful to society, or it's being
here's a better
correctly.
Yeah, here's a better idea. I think the distinction you want to make is between natural law and divine revelation.
I wouldn't even say that though, because the term natural law has been so slandered and so abused. I would agree with more along the lines of what Fascist Ball said, in that we have legitimate reasons based on our religious belief to ban pornography, but at the same time, the case can be reasonably made that pornography is a public health issue.
Exactly.
As such, you could ban it on those grounds. I think there's one of the things I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, but natural. This is what I'm saying. Natural law is just the natural apprehension of God, of morality in the world. It's and since basically, I'm basically agreeing with you. Natural law is something that anybody can come to with their reason, regardless of what kind of supernatural faith they hold.
Well, that's kind of the same line of reasoning that ANCAPs use to justify how, if we just give people enough time, eventually everybody will come around to the idea of ANCAPistan being the best way of doing things. I think.
Well, Murray Rothbard doesn't know a darn thing about natural law. If he is when ANCAPs say natural law, they don't understand what that means. That's just a meme to them. Natural law is just a constitution.
I mean, they don't even respect, like, the ideology of anarchism doesn't even respect natural law, because natural anarchism is not natural. It's a very, very, very artificial concept. Because when you have a certain community of people, there's always going to, some form of authority is going to come out. And when you deal with anarchism on the intellectual level, there is a very, very, very big hole that is in anarchism, a gigantic hole. And the NAP, what it's trying to do, the principle of non-aggression, what it's just trying to do is trying to cover that hole. And that whole being that violence is a thing, and that you can use violence to achieve your goals, be it political, be it social, be it whatever it is. You cannot have anarchism when you can use violence, because violence, at the end of the day, is the ultimate authority.
Well, yeah, plus the NAP is not natural law.
Exactly.
Self-ownership in the Rothbardian sense is not justified by natural law. I would point to some of Edward Fazer's great essays critiquing Rothbard and his philosophy, because Rothbard was a crap philosopher.
Oh, definitely.
I
think the NAP gets one thing right, in the sense that it's a good baseline in some sense. I think that things are better off being voluntary. And this is sort of something Aristotle gets at in Nicomachean Ethics a little bit, because one of the things he starts off by saying is that a decision is only truly moral when it's made voluntarily. That's not to say that people are always going to make the moral decision when they act voluntarily, but that to be truly moral, a decision has to be made freely, which also kind of goes back to the John Paul II quote you mentioned early. Real freedom is choosing to do what's right, as opposed to just being allowed to do whatever the hell you want.
So, freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that a lot of ANCAPs lose. But at the same time, it still comes to the question of whether or not, how, obviously, knowing that people aren't going to make the moral decision, how hard do you force them to make that decision anyway? Like, where's the cutoff? How hard are we going to try to turn people into moral actors using state authority before it becomes totalitarianism and it goes too far? And I think that's the big question that I'm trying to get at here with what form of governance would best fit a Catholic belief system.
Well, if you were to ask me, I would say you fit it within if the state is guided within by the constraints of natural law and good men who have a good sense of prudence and prudential judgment, a good prudential judgment, then those two things will provide the limits to what is good governance, and also trying to uphold promises is all. Trying to uphold promises is part of natural law, because you don't. And what is like the social contract, but a promise made to made to the people of that society. Of course, I don't believe in the Rousseauian thing that the government gets its authority from the social contract. I view the social contract more as like the government says, okay, we promise that you follow us, and we promise to uphold, to do X, Y, and Z. That's generally how that works. But so yeah, basically I think natural law and prudential judgment, or what you would call pragmatism, is what guides good Catholic governance.
But however, the thing that the social construct doesn't take into consideration too much is the importance of the state. The state is something that is very, very important. It is one of the most. It is the most important thing in statocracy. The not in statocracy. Sorry, in statecraft. The most important thing in statecraft is the state, because the state is the absolute representation, the most pure form of the will of the nation, because there should be no separation between state and nation. When you
I don't actually buy into that sort of thing. I believe the state is an institution that derives all of its power. It doesn't derive all its power from representing the people. It derives its power from above, from God.
because the state doesn't need to represent. The state doesn't need to indirectly represent the people, at least not in the way that democracy has tried to do it.
I don't think it needs to represent the people in the way that something like fascism represents it, because I don't think that power from below is a particularly coherent way of running a government.
And it is not. It is not. I agree. The people cannot be necessarily trusted to run the government. The government has to be run a little bit from within. But the main point of statocracy, I keep saying statocracy, of statecraft, is to try to make the line that divides the nation and the state as thin as possible. You try to make these two concepts as close as possible. And once these two concepts are the same thing, you have succeeded in statocracy. Now, democracy tries to do this by making the people vote for representatives, and therefore the representatives are going to strive for actually representing the citizens that voted them in, and not just to make their party more influential, and therefore making themselves more influential in the government. Because as soon as you have two parties, they're going to stop looking for the interest of the nations, and they're going to start looking for the interest of their own party, and they're going to start looking for how can we do the worst to this other party, how can we stay in power, how can we avoid this other party from becoming in power. And it begins to be more of a blood sport between parties and less of a government, and this is what we're experiencing right now in Western democracies.
Well, I would say,
sorry,
okay, go on. Go on, pragmatic. Sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is that's exactly the point I bring up. And it's interesting that I come at it from a bit of a different perspective, possibly, than you, Fascist Paul, as I haven't, I don't know if you've happened to have read any Hegel, but Hegel is somebody I'm just getting into. And a lot of what you're talking about here, I think, sort of speaks to what Hegel called like the Geist, or the spirit of the nation, and how fascism tries to unify the spirit and of the people and the spirit of the nation, and represent that as effectively as possible. And honestly, I think there is certainly something to that, although one of the things I fall back on personally is sort of the notion of the tragedy of the commons as described by Plato, where I'm sort of opposed to popular will in a lot of different forms, in that I don't really trust people to properly govern themselves in any sense, because most people just don't know what they want and don't really know how to handle their own lives. And so giving them political authority, no matter really how it's represented, isn't going to be best for large swaths of people. And you'll always have to be making perpetual compromise into what inevitably devolves into sort of a system that doesn't benefit anybody except the few people who claim to be speaking for the Geist or for the will or for popular majority. And that's kind of why I advocate for a monarchy and the return of some form of an aristocracy, because you have this group of people who are sort of similar to the idea of Plato's philosopher kings, but they're people who still have the interest of the nations at heart. Because if you return to like the feudalist notion of the noble owns this land and the peasants sort of till it and they pay him tribute, and the king owns like the rest of the nation and the nobles are paying him tribute, that kind of thing, there's some notion of ownership to it, and it's your idea of it being your property, and you're looking to better your property for your successors so that you leave them with something good. And this is the whole thing Hoppe gets into in Democracy, the God That Fails. But overall, I think it's a useful notion for maintaining a state, because when you apply individual ownership of it to some extent, you're more likely to take good care of it and care for the assets on that land, the assets being not only the land itself and the resources, but the people who utilize them. And so I feel like monarchy sort of is the best compromise between the two things you're talking about, where you're not surrendering to political factions, but at the same time, you're still not leaving it to unwashed masses.
When we talk about
I can't really. I can't really take this. I mean, I don't really think that monarchies have ever really worked all that well. I mean, if you looked at, if you look at the various monarchies of the past, they only worked so long as they were highly decentralized, so that the nation didn't even exist per se.
Not necessarily.
I don't think that.
Even if the monarchy were decentralized, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it. Like, I'm fully on board with the concept that nation states, as we know them today, are far too large to be effective bodies of governance, because the type of people they're governing are so diverse, it's impossible to accurately represent any of their interests. So I'm all for nations becoming much smaller than they are today, and having sort of monarchies like the Holy Roman Empire had with its various duchies and such.
But it just kind of comes across as a bit LARPy. I mean, I don't think you could ever have an effective monarchy even in the modern day. I see republics as more of an ideal, because republics, as I believe one Roman, I forgot his name, but he talked about in this work Res Publica, how the republic embodies the best aspects of the democracy, the aristocracy, and the monarchy, in how it's run. And that's why I think that the republics are better. And when you say that when people own the land, they'll take care of it better. Well,
are you talking about the Republic, the Respublica?
Yes.
That's Plato.
No, that's not Plato. Plato was Greek. This guy was Roman. He wrote a book called Res Publica.
Cicero?
Yes, that was him. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. When we talk about decentralization of the government, this is a very important topic, especially for within the right, because this is mainly the thing that divides us, is whether we should have a centralized government, whether we should have a decentralized government, whether we should have a big government, whether we should have a small government. And this is key for a state, because you're saying that, okay, so monarchies, we didn't have the concept of state back then. We did have we did have governments, but not necessarily things such as nation states. A kingdom was not a nation. A kingdom, if we look at the kingdom of France in the 10th century, it's not, it's the possession of one person. It's the personal lands that one person has, and this person is ruling with authority just because he owns that land, because that land is his personal backyard. It's his private property, and he is with his private property, delegating some of the power for the sake of administrative efficiency. And this, after things like the 100-Year War stops being a thing, and so nations move more towards being a body, towards being independent and no longer the private property of an individual, but rather this individual ruling this nation. And this is when we shift from kingdoms and from feudalism towards absolutism and towards nation states. So in this regard, we haven't had too many very, very successful nation states that we have had some, but not as many as republics, because monarchies kind of lose a little bit of their legitimacy. Monarchies lose a little bit of the legitimacy once you shift from being the private property of one individual and becoming a nation. But this doesn't mean that there can be autocracy, because we know what would be logical after after replacing the king would be to replace it with a peer, a government of peers, a public government, making the government a public thing, a res publica in Latin. But no revolution that exists, such as the French Revolution or anything, is going to produce stable results if it doesn't illuminate their leader. Because only the leader is able to guess what is buried, what the masses want. And this has been shown in revolutions throughout history, that they always have to have one charismatic leader, be it Napoleon, that later took over the collapsing system of the French Revolution, be it Lenin, Stalin, be it whoever you want, Mao. Any example is always going to show that there cannot be any revolution if it doesn't have a leader. So in this kind of proves that autocracy is natural for humans. Not necessarily monarchy, but autocracy. The rule of one charismatic individual, because the autocracies have been, and monarchies being one type of autocracy, have been the system that we have had for most of our history. And most governments we've ever had, regardless of what they claim to be, have been autocracies.
Well, that is a strong argument for autocracy, but is that really a good argument for? But I don't see how you could say that that's the best government. Autocracies have been unstable in the past. I mean, look at the front monarchies and
always being unstable in the past. Any government has been unstable in the past. The thing is not whether this government can or cannot be unstable, but that we have mechanisms inside the government and inside the state that can renew the state, that can actualize the state in order for it not to become destable. Because any kind of government, it doesn't matter who is ruling it, except if it is God, that government can become unstable, because instability doesn't come from the government; it comes from outside influences.
that sort of despotism, I don't think is I don't see any reason that we should desire something like an autocracy, because
let me put it this way. Let me put despotism or autocracy this way. The boss, or the chief, the leader, the dictator, whatever you want to call it, doesn't need to obey the people. This Rousseauian thing that the government has to obey, or the chief, the boss has to obey the people. This is a Rousseauian concept, law. You can throw it to the garbage. This doesn't work. Most of our history has been the opposite way. The boss doesn't need to obey the people. He must serve it, not obey it, but serve it, because it is
was there in the Bible, Samuel, that there was this warning against what would happen if Israel had a king like all the other
Well, I think that's a bit of a
nations.
different situation in that what God was warning the people against with Samuel was that, well, he kind of predicted this in that obviously having a king meant that being bound to him, and as such a small nation, you'd be bound to his follies because if he led the nation astray, then, that was kind of it. There's a larger quote on this in general. A king may either be a Marcus Aurelius or a Nero, but democratically elected, but a president will often be a Nero, but never a Marcus Aurelius. And I think it's funny you mentioned that because even before, like in the book of Samuel, the people of Israel still had autocrats in some sense because they had judges. And the reason the people wanted a king was because they felt disunited partially, and they wanted to be a more single nation because at the time they were still very much divided by tribes. And so they wanted the king, for one, for unification so that they could have greater defensive power, and two, because they just wanted to be like the kingdoms around them. It was sort of a status symbol and respect at the time. But it was still some form of autocratic rule, no matter how you look at it. It's, in fact, more closely resembles Plato's philosopher kings pre the installing of Solomon than post the installing of, or not the installing of Solomon, but who was the first king before David? I can't remember his name.
Saul.
Saul, yes, Saul. Something else with an S. But yeah, before they installed Saul as the king, it was a series of judges who were ruling over Israel and ruling over the 12 tribes. And so it was still some sort of philosopher king-esque situation, no matter how you slice it. It's just that with Saul, the people got one king over the entire 12 tribes, which made it a little bit more dangerous, I suppose, because now you have the fate of the whole Jewish people in your hands. And I guess this sort of goes back to your point of decentralization. So I think there's...
But I don't see how, if you have an autocracy, that and that the ruler will ever actually follow any kind of moral precepts.
Okay, so you can make the point that, you can have a bad king, you can have a bad leader, a bad dictator, a bad boss, but, bosses and leaders can be wrong because they're human. You're never going to have a perfect human ruling you.
Well, obviously, but if you have a bad person ruling you, and you have a government system that attracts bad people, like an autocracy, then you'll end up like medieval China.
Marcus Aurelius lived in an autocratic regime, and he was one of the best rulers. Most of the best rulers, almost all of the best rulers that we know throughout history were autocratic leaders.
Well, that's because most of our rulers, period, were from autocratic systems.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean that this systems attract this kind of people.
Yeah, I think when you have a system of power like this, it's always going to attract people who are seeking to abuse it. The one thing I would say that monarchy actually helps, and sort of autocracy in general sort of helps stave off, is people from gaining this power through just sort of promising the people all sorts of trinkets and whatever. What you have with monarchy is you have something where obviously you have to still account for the good of the people on your property, because there's always that threat of violent revolt, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have to give them free shit because that's not good for them. You can govern knowing while doing what's right, without being burdened to or being chained to the will of the people. Because there's some sort of level on which monarchs were highly trained and highly skilled politicians. They were raised by scholars and philosophers and politicians and statisticians and all these sorts of things. And we really don't see that anymore because we've sort of blurred the line between who can be a ruler and who can't be. And we've sort of lowered the barrier of entry so much so.
The only requirement for being a ruler now is being popular.
Yeah, exactly. And so if
that's the problem,
becomes a popularity contest, it just turns out that you're going to get a bunch of popular tyrants eventually because they keep what they want.
Like George Lincoln Rockwell said, is that society needs to be ruled by the best, not by the most popular, but by the best.
Yes, but I don't think that autocracy can give us the best. I think that
It
a
has
more
done
of
that
elite.
historically.
Well, I think that an elitist republic gives us the best.
Not necessarily. An elitist republic is just going to be one group of people constantly oppressing the lower classes and constantly being
As
over
opposed
them.
to opposed to one king constantly oppressing everybody.
No, the one king is not going to constantly oppress more people because the point, this clique that you're proposing to put in power, the only thing that is going to look after is maintaining their powers because cliques, since there are several people, there's always going to be competition of power between those people. The same way that if you put more than one party ruling a country, a multi-party system, the parties are going to stop looking for the good of the nation and they're going to start looking how to maintain themselves in power, and they're going to start scrambling the one against the other, and this is not going to be government anymore, it's just going to be blood sports. Well, this is going to be the same when you have an elite that is ruling the country. This is going to stop being about looking for the good of the nation, and it's going to start being for each one of these oligarchs looking how to maintain their power, how to avoid this other faction from keeping power, from getting to power, and this is going to be just blood sports in the elite, and it's not going to be about ruling the people. The reason why I was talking about autocracy and why I think that autocracy is what is best for where, like Plato said, the system where one man rules for the good of everything, is because yes, kings can be wrong because they're humans. You can be educated as much as you want, they're not going to stop being human. And for the same reason, the cause to obey, the king can be mistaken when the people judge and they believe
Okay,
that
but
things are wrong.
um, e- e- what if a good king comes along and says, "I'm going to violate all the rights of my people for the good of the kingdom"?
It wouldn't do that. That is not a possibility because a good king is not going to do such a thing because he knows that it is not the right thing to do to violate all the rights of the people. That is not that there's no way to look at it saying that, oh, this is for the greater good, because that'd just be a lie. He wouldn't be a good king. He would just be a dick that is going to eventually get assassinated by the Praetorian Guard.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point because one of the things about, well, first off, I'd like to make the point that one of the things that Hoppe goes into great length detailing in Democracy, the God That Fails, that all the supposed suppressions of freedom under monarchy that we're kind of taught today in like our democratically biased society didn't really occur. Like, we know about the taxes that the British incurred on the colonies, taxation without representation and such, but those altogether amounted to what today would just be like a 15% income tax. And the highest income tax that you normally saw on like the European continent during the age of like the Holy Roman Empire and the various kingdoms of Europe was around 8%. And I mean, compare that to where like you live in states like California, New York, or on like the East Coast and West Coast in general, and they're taking practically 50% of your income or 40%. So that's just one example. On top of that, there's a lot of like little things that are considered major broaches of freedom like today that we still sort of have. Like, of course, there were minor things about behavioral quirks that weren't allowed out in public that might have seemed like a big deal at the time, but we still have dress codes in public today. Like, most cities don't allow public nudity or anything like that. Obviously, they've become a bit more laxed, but they're not. There certainly are still dress codes. There's still some sort of standard of public decency, and that's all really things like our laws today are practicing. And so you don't really have this massive broach of freedom as we did.
Yeah, and this is what I was talking about, because even if a country is autocratic and has maybe a couple limitations on the personal freedom, individual freedoms, it doesn't mean that the autocrat has absolute power. And one of the main uh, aspects of fascism is to prevent this from happening, to prevent the leader from becoming too powerful, because in fascism the leader can be impeached, you know because Mussolini was impeached by the he was eventually set back because impeaching is not removing a person from office, as many people think it is. Impeaching is just bringing a certain individual in front of the Congress or whatever ruling body there is, to judge him for a crime, and then if he is found guilty, then eventually, remove him from office. Mussolini was impeached, but he was absolved by the councils of fascism.
Yeah, I think Buckley had to bow out for just a second, but if he comes back, that's honestly something I was looking to ask you about for a bit, because honestly, the concept of Catholicism and fascism certainly isn't foreign to me. Obviously, Franco's Spain was a good example of what would be described as a clerical fascism, I suppose would be the best term
Yes.
I could think of. But I wonder sometimes, is there, obviously, when people think of fascism, they think of massive rights violations. And of course, this isn't exactly the case. But how is it ensured in a fascist system that things don't go too far? Because it seems like in the hands of the monarch, there is not only the peasantry that can revolt, but there's also a nobility that you have to please as well. So it seems like there's another failsafe built in there. But with fascism, it doesn't seem to have that same failsafe. So what exactly is the barrier between a proper, like, sort of benevolent fascist state and sort of tyranny?
Um, I would say that the border, like the line between that, is how much power does the dictator have, how much power the party has. Because the dictator draws its power from his own executive charisma, from his own will, from how much he is capable of passing laws, of executing stuff, making orders and stuff like that. But the party gets its powers directly from the constitution, of the organic laws that the country has. And every single fascist country is going to have organic laws, because without organic laws, it would be a shit show. There's absolutely no way how to run a fascist state without organic laws. And organic laws is something like a constitution, but not quite, because a constitution, it's treated like a supreme document, that nothing is above the constitution. In fascism, an organic law would be something that is at the same level as the ruling body, where nothing that is not the ruling body, everything has to abide by this document.
So it's kind of like Britain. It's kind of like Britain's ruling tradition, in the sense that they don't have a constitution per se, but they have a tradition of laws that they sort of uphold.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad that you bring up Britain, because Britain's example is that the Queen is above the law, because it is for the Queen that the law is being, the law exists. Passports are issued because of the Queen. I don't know how to explain this, but on behalf of the Queen, everything is done on behalf of the Queen. The reason why the government exists is because it's in behalf of the Queen. Well, fascism is something similar, but it's on behalf of the state. Everything is done on behalf of the state and on behalf of the party, depending on how much the party influences. Obviously in clerical fascism, there's not going to be a political party, but the state is going to be run by, the church. There's not going to be separation between the church and the state. But you understand what I'm saying, right? So yeah. Every single fascist country is going to have certain organic law, and if you read this organic law, you're going to see that there's actually rights that are being guaranteed in this organic law, and the police is not going to break the law and then get away with it, because that is simply not how it works. Because there's still rule of law under fascism, and there is still punishment for being the stereotype that believes that the police can do anything to you in a fascist state, and there's nothing you can do about it because the police is completely false, and it's a complete Hollywood lie.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I sort of appreciate about fascism in that sense, is that there is this understanding that natural law and law in general is something less to be legislated and something more to be known and lived in general. And I think that's been one of the major failings of a democratic state, is that we've begun to legislate rights, quote unquote, that are more positive rights. They're entitlements, not really freedoms that you're bestowed as like something created by God or something like that. It's things that you're supposedly owed for existing. And so there is that respect, which I greatly admire. And there was something to be said about that in the monarchies of old as well. Now, in your mind, what would make fascism preferable? I mean, we've gone into it a bit with democracy, but what would make it preferable to a monarchic state in particular? Like, what would be the appeal to Franco Spain as opposed to England's monarchy pre Henry VIII?
Um, Basically, the economics, basically the industrial revolution, basically the fact that monarchies are no longer as effective as they used to be now that we have the industrial revolution. And this is the industrial revolution is one of the things I argue the most with people like distributionists, because they're completely opposed to it and they believe that it's like one of the biggest disasters that human history has always had, and we just need to get rid of it somehow, pretend like it didn't happen, try to revert its effects as much as possible. Well, fascism kind of takes a different approach, and it tries to utilize this to acknowledge that the industrial revolution actually happened and to try to benefit from it without trying to make traditionalism benefit from the industrial revolution, instead of believing that the industrial revolution is the cause of all the problems that we have right now regarding the erasing of traditionalism from society.
Right. Yeah, that's sort of the embracing of third positionism mostly, right?
Exactly. But nowadays, if you try to talk about it with the current political climate, if you try to talk about third positionism, since everything is so polarized, if you say something about third positionism, or you turn out to be right wing in this and that aspect, but you also have some very left, quote unquote, leftist positions where you support, public healthcare or public banking or another, so you're gonna be, oh yeah, you're Nasbol, you're this, that, but your political position is not serious. But third positionism and syncretic politics have always existed, and have always been an alternative towards this division of left and right that the French Revolution imposed us.
Yeah, I've sort of been picking up on that lately, and I've sort of enjoyed it because I haven't. I've been noticing that there has been some point to the sort of not it's strictly leftist idea, but the idea that capitalism as a system is closer to a tool, and as a tool, it can be used by good people or bad people. It just happens to be depending on who is using it. And I think, funnily enough, Murdoch made this point in one of their more recent episodes as sort of a joke. But I thought it rang sort of true, because what you have now in the form of this system, that this market-based system effectively that we have in the United States, is one where everything is marketable, from all sorts of degeneracy like sex change operations and
Yeah.
VR porn and
I mean, all of this is just a result of materialism. All of it is a complete result of materialism. You can blame whoever you want, and of course, there's gonna be some echoes and everything you want, but at the end of the day, the main cause of all of this is a materialistic culture.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you can. I don't like the idea that necessarily the market causes degeneracy. I think you could say it promotes it, because it just takes advantage of whatever environment it's in. But I don't believe that the free market left to its own devices necessarily causes degeneracy. But at the same time, in the situation we're in, and knowing there are some people who eventually take kind of control of a free market system, because that's the thing about a free market system, is it's inherently negative in its being, and as such it can't really exist for all that long before it's co-opted by somebody with a positive ideology. And so I think Franco actually did this very well in Spain. Was he had, obviously a third positionist sort of system, but it leaned market based, which allowed it to be, I think, at its height, something like the eighth largest GDP in the world, very low unemployment. It was, it was economically a very stable state. And I think that's another thing that allowed it to last as long as it did, and not fall to some sort of revolution.
I like to call the Spanish system. It's a little bit of a fascism with Chinese characteristics.
Right, right. Like the way that China sort of manages its capitalism with the various economic zones
Yeah.
and things like that.
But it's a misconception that Spain was fully capitalist and that was just authoritarian capitalism. No, the government, if we look at actual authoritarian capitalist system like Pinochet's Chile and Spain, it was fairly different. Not
Mm.
one like it was not like radically different, but it was not different that what the government of France and the United States might have been. They're different, but they're not obviously they're not like radically different in any
Yeah.
sense.
Well, I think
But go
a
on.
lot of sorry, well, I was just going to point out that a lot of market liberals like to, point to Pinochet, and this is say it's an example of the free market working perfectly. And, to some extent that's true. There was greater liberalization under Pinochet, but at the same time, he's also someone who tossed out a lot of the private bankers from his nation and established it as a firmly state-owned business, which is honestly something I think I'm not a huge fan of central banks because I still have that sort of libertarian leaning in me. But at the same time, I think the idea of, as opposed to having this facade like we do in the United States, where the central bank is like, is it privately owned? Is it state owned? Is it somewhere in the middle? Yada, yada, yada. Rather than having that, just having it outright state owned and, putting good people in charge of it, I think would be something that's more beneficial than trying to maintain some private banking system where whoever can take control of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was a lot like a couple of years back when I was like very, very skeptical towards this, saying nothing good can come out of, central banking. Oh, central banking is just this. Until I actually read what, the actual point of central banking was and the benefits that you could get towards the benefits that you could get from good management of a central banking system. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, if this is implemented correctly, it can actually do a lot of good.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of not being, for lack of a better word, autistically free market, because
Yeah,
there's, you can do things on aggregate that do benefit people. There isn't this sort of like, oh, you have to operate on the individual level and give them total market control, because that's like, it's ineffective. It doesn't need to be that way.
yeah, you can't be a full-on Austrian because if you're a full-on Austrian, you're just wenting how do you call this? Just a point of insertion inside of the economic system that is just not going to come alone. You actually need some government implication inside of the economy if you want things to actually move. And
Mm.
if you look at Spain's economy and how it was regulated by the government, you can see that the government actually played a huge role in it. There was a lot of mining companies that were directly run by the government, especially the ones in Asturias. I remember even my own grandfather was employed by one of these state-owned companies, and he said that um, that he had like government officials inspecting this and that every 5 minutes, and sometimes they wouldn't even let the managers that had actual how do you call this that actually bought some parts of the enterprise, live because
Yeah,
they
right.
needed to like they were very strict towards uh, meeting all of the government standards on how the company needs to be run.
Mm. Yeah, and that's another thing too. You know, it's often said it's often libertarians who make the point that, oh, if the government didn't regulate X, Y, and Z, companies would just do it anyway. And so, like, what's the point? What's the harm then if governments just regulate it anyway, just to make it double sure that it's actually going to happen? It's very much a moot point, I think. But I think we've kind of run the gauntlet on Catholicism and governance here so much. I think we've kind of strayed off
Yeah,
the
we're
path.
talking about economics now, and
Yeah.
we strayed a lot towards economics. But uh, let's talk about, since we're talking about both economics and Catholicism is the point of the stream a little bit. Let's talk about distributionism a little bit. Have you
Mm.
ever heard about that?
I have. I mean, I first heard about it through the YouTuber himself, like the Distributist, and then I eventually did a little digging around in it myself. For the most part, I find it unworkable, not only from a modern context, but I kind of view it as a Catholic go around of communism, honestly. I mean, it's not obviously that bad because it lacks the moral implications that communism does, but
Yeah.
the mode of distribution, I think, is inefficient in what they're trying to do. Even when it was first being suggested, I don't think it ever had a chance of really working.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a system that is mainly trying to ignore that the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution happened at all. I don't know if I explain myself, but trying to spread the means of production as widely as possible and having each individual own their own means of production. It's a bit how things were done, like how economic worked in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. And distributionism is trying to recreate, not completely, obviously, because that would be impossible, but trying to, in a sort, recreate this economic state, believing that the contradictions and injustices of capitalism would just fade away if we go back to pre-capitalism.
Yeah, and it's a very naive hope, and I think it's one that's kind of impossible. And I think I think people like Evola, with what little I've read of him, I've been able to glean that he does kind of have this attitude of, rather than trying to return tradition, building something from the ruins of tradition and going forward with it, as opposed to trying to achieve what we had in the past.
Yeah, I mean, Evola, if you try to get any um, Catholic on Twitter to read Evola, and you actually make him read something like, I don't want to say something as, bad, for lack of a better word, as, something like the metaphysics of sex or something like that. But if you try to make him read Revolt, if you don't just tell them, listen, ignore the first part, just go to the second half of the book, they're gonna be like, what is this? Are you making me read some satanic esoteric shit or something?
Yeah, well, you suggested to me when I asked you about this. Hold on, I have his name here in my. I left it open in Chrome. Jose de.
Rivera.
Yes. Yes.
Antonio Primo de Rivera. Yeah, he's one of the most important theorists of fascism.
Mm. And is he a phalangist specifically, or is he
Yep.
just
Phalangism.
interesting? Is there
I mean,
is there anything in particular that you think is worth mentioning that signifies or that differentiates phalangism from fascism proper?
yes,
Let's say.
yes. Fascism proper is a little bit of a naked ideology in a sense that it doesn't take, the identity of any nation. It's just, the corporatism, like raw corporatism. Meanwhile, phalangism is a mix between this form of fascism, between fascism with this very strong Catholic identity.
I like that. It sounds good.
Yeah, yeah. And if you ask Rivera and you ask him, "Are you a phalangist?" He's probably going to tell you, "No, I'm a fascist." Well, what are you talking about? Because this division between national syndicalism, phalangism, all of this doesn't come until after he's dead. So he
Right.
won't be able to tell you something like that. Like, he uses national syndicalism and fascism interchangeable, because national syndicalism, when he was alive, was just another word for fascism, because there was a current of their positionism that was going on in Europe, and everything ranging from national syndicalism to national socialism, everything referred to this one unified ideology of fascism. It was not until the Germans and Hitler put their own system of fascism into Germany and call it National Socialism, that National Socialism actually starts meaning something different from fascism, that kind of separates, or I won't say separates because this is not like a schism or something like that. It kind of evolves from fascism to adopt, the political climate that Germany was at the time.
Yeah, no, I see that, and it makes sense. No political ideology is ever essentially static. You have the various offshoots of Marxist thought today. You have the various offshoots of conservative thought and things like that, or which are really just offshoots of liberalism and things like that. But I get why I could see the necessity for naked fascism or corporatism to just evolve and take on more of a solid identity. And of course, phalangism is going to appeal to us, obviously, because we're Catholic and we find that the most correct moral system to have it attached to, obviously. But I could, it's going to be different for every person. But I think there's so long as there's that underlying principle, which I enjoy. Of have you read a lot of Hegel personally, or are you more into sort of the later fascist writers, or more specifically, like the fascist writers who took from Hegel but don't directly reference him in the way somebody like a Gentile might?
Gentile, because I have tried my best to read philosophy. I've tried to read Kant. I've read a little of Hegel, but I am definitely not a man of philosophy. I kind of struggle to understand many of the. I mean, I can read it. Like, it's not like I'm gonna read like a couple pages and I have no idea what he's talking about. But I kind of have the idea of it. But I'm definitely not a man of philosophy. I am much more comfortable when you talk about statecraft and economics than I am with philosophy.
Well, it's good.
Philosophy is just not my
Yeah, statecraft is practical. Statecraft is essentially the practical application of philosophy. So I can see why you'd prefer one over the other, simply because there's more of a real world use, quote unquote, for one over the other. Although, of course, to some extent, philosophy is absolutely necessary, but you could leave that to other people for the moment being.
Yeah, of course.
So, well, I think that was a good talk. I think, unfortunately, Buckley ducked out, but I think we kind of got the main points across, and I think we can kind of sort of come to a bit of an idea that the ideal Catholic form of governance isn't necessarily one where it's popular will, and it isn't necessarily where it's the will of one man.
And it not necessarily also as well, not necessarily one where the clergy rules, because with the solution that many Catholics on Twitter are gonna give you is that, oh yeah, if you want to have a good Catholic society, you just give all the political power to the clergy and just see that they'll figure out to do something. That is not necessarily the way to go, and the Rivera states this constantly.
Yeah, so I think it's obviously going to be an ongoing discussion, but of course, this is a good talk. Do you have anything else you want to add real quick before I think we just bow out here?
No, I think it was good. Yeah, I think that was enough.
All right, cool. Thank you everybody for stopping by and giving this a listen, and I'll catch you all next time.
See you.